So I just wanted to make a couple comments on an issue that a couple people have brought up to me more recently, and someone specifically said in some of my comments there was a disagreement between myself and another Lutheran pastor over some certain use of theological terminology. You can see my video on the presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper, and there was a theological debate here, and the theological debate really wasn't even theology. It was just what terminology you use to refer to the thing that we agree on. But someone made a comment that some of these debates that we have online and some of the heat that is often found on the internet or between pastors, or this is not just in the world of theology, but this is just in the world of online debate in general, is that oftentimes there are cultural and class differences that kind of get maybe unnoticed in some of these debates that really do help to explain certain things and certain dynamics of debates. And I think it's an astute observation. It is something certainly that I've thought about a lot. So, and I can tell you that I've thought about it a lot just in my own experience. Just for those who don't know, kind of my background, I grew up in Western Massachusetts, so I'm from New England. My family is from the Northeast. Extended family had been in New Jersey since, the 1600s. I had family that came over on the Mayflower. My whole family is all very Northeastern. And, if you know much about the culture of the Northeast versus some other parts of the United States, it's very different in a lot of ways. People in the Northeast tend to, for example, come across as very rude to other people. So you kind of have to learn when you're dealing with other people how to actually be nice. But that's another question. But just as an example, right? We do everything very quickly. I talk quickly. You may have noticed that. I actually slowed down my speech pretty significantly in doing this podcast because I naturally talk a lot faster than that. But I have had to, in various ministry contexts, stop myself from some of those idiosyncrasies that are very kind of particular area culturally, determined. And that's the case of every part of every nation. Now, I'm speaking specifically in the context of the United States. And this is certainly even more true when you're talking about various differences between nations. And I know that most of my listeners are from English-speaking countries predominantly, so United States and Canada and England, Ireland. But I do have some that listen from Brazil and other places as well that are not predominantly English-speaking. But something that I think happens on the internet that you just don't see as much in real life is on the internet, you kind of assume a monoculture in some ways because everybody's talking on the same forums. And when you have people say on Twitter or on a Facebook group or in comments on YouTube, you hear somebody talking and you hear the language they use and you see the things that they do. You see the way that they conduct themselves. And when you are from a certain location, especially if you've grown up in that place and haven't moved to other places, you're going to assume, because that's what you do in ordinary life, which is what you should do in ordinary life in a particular locale, is you are going to read the words and ideas of another individual in the way that they speak, the way that they present themselves, in light of what you know in your experience and how that would be accepted in your own particular culture. This can lead to a lot of confusion and a lot of kind of talking past one another. And I think it really, thinking through where somebody's from, thinking through their experiences and what their context is, especially when we're talking about it in a ministry context, can very much, I think, help us to have a little bit of grace for other people when we may not necessarily agree with, say, the way that they're doing things. So for as one example, look at the ministry of somebody like Tim Keller. Now, I know Tim Keller gets a lot of flack from a lot of people. The only reason I'm thinking of Keller today is because today they just made that announcement of there's some kind of like Keller organization, institute named after him. So that's the only reason he's coming to mind right now. But there are plenty of others. But I think he's he's illustrative of this because he's in New York City, and he may speak a little differently from some other people in other parts of the nation. And there are times where perhaps he is not as forthright about certain things as some people would be. And yeah, I do think that some of that is theological debate. Some of that is difference about, how you approach certain things in maybe a broader sense. But I do think that at least a significant amount of that has to do with a misunderstanding of ministry context and in importing of your own ministry context into the life and ministry of somebody else. So just maybe give you a couple of examples of how this works out. I remember having a bit of a debate with somebody about the question of sanctification. And this is a Lutheran pastor. And it was a question about, how you preach on sanctification. And this pastor was one who I was concerned by some of the things he was saying was leaning a bit in the antinomian direction. And I remember in that conversation, eventually it came to a point where the pastor started telling me about the actual circumstances of his congregation and the community that he lives in. And he was explaining to me, it's a place that is largely filled with very legalistic Baptist fundamentalist churches. Some of his congregants had come out of that background. They were very kind of legally minded in the way that they did things, so that his preaching was suited to that particular context. That was a number of years ago that I had that conversation, but that conversation has stuck with me because it's been a reminder to me that in my own ministry and context, I can't assume somebody else's ministry and context. I can't assume that they're dealing with the same things I am, or I'm dealing with the same things they are. And I think a lot of the kind of yelling on social media, the attacking on social media, you use this term, even though I totally agree with you, I use a different term, that can just be talking past one another. A lot of that is determined by culture, because there are certain things that in one culture you can say and people will listen to them. And in another culture, you have to be tactful and a little more nuanced or careful in how you say certain things. So I do every once in a while get this. There's an accusation that I've seen toward me, and I get it, that I'm an elitist, and I made this comment on YouTube that I said, yeah, I'm one of those East Coast elites, and I put it in quotes, and all these people were saying that I was claiming to be an elite. It was in quotes because it's something that I'm referencing. It's been thrown at me as an insult more than once. That's the perception of me. Nobody literally calls themselves an East Coast elite. Okay, so it was kind of I've seen this, right? I've seen that, say in the Lutheran world, because I'm a Lutheran, but a lot of Lutherans are in the rural Midwestern United States, and the culture of the rural Midwestern United States is very different from the culture of where I live. So, and I'm in upstate New York, so maybe, certainly not as different here as it would be, say, if I was in New York City, but still, it is significantly different, and certainly different than the culture that I grew up in. So I have been told, because of the language that I use, that I'm being overly academic, and I'm trying to show off my academic prowess and things like that. And I think that this is just, I'm urging people. It's not just about me, but I've had this thrown out at me, and because I'm trying to do this too. But I urge people to kind of not put the worst construction on things like that, and maybe assume that maybe I speak in the way that I do because people around me when I was raised spoke in the way that I do. And that's true. I remember my wife and I having these conversations when we went out to serve a parish in Iowa. It was in rural Iowa. It was a very different part of the country. And we had to change, both of us had to significantly change the words that we used, because we spoke in language that sometimes people would just say, what does that word mean? Or what does that word mean? And it comes across as elitist, of like, you think you're using these big words because you want to be, show that you're better. But it's really just different culture, because to be honest, going out to Iowa, they would talk about all the farming stuff that they were doing, and I had no idea what they were talking about either. That's how we learn from each other and talk to each other and listen, because we have different cultures, even within one nation. Yeah, there are some things that unite America as a nation in terms of some cultural ideas, the prizing of freedom and expression in the way that we do. There are many things that are uniquely American, but even within the American nation, there are a wide variety of cultures, even within a pretty small radius. So this is really this video is really nothing more than just to kind of urge that these are things that we need to think through as we're having conversations. And we can't just assume that everybody's experience is our own. Everybody's culture is our culture. And that's maybe before you take offense to something that someone says or make an assumption, stop and actually think kind of where they're coming from and what their context is, especially if it's ministry related in one way or another. So I do think, some of these debates that we have, say among Lutherans or within a denomination, some of that really is city versus rural. And it could be theological differences, but a lot of it is not necessarily theological differences. It could just be ministry context differences and cultural differences. So sometimes it's hard to kind of tease out which of those is which, but I think it is something that we are called to do. So, well, I hope you found this interesting and helpful. Make sure you subscribe. See you in the next one. God bless.